Well, hello, Steve.
Hello, Byron.
We were chatting a few moments before the webinar, and it's nice to see you here on Zoom again. And we welcome everyone who is joining us. There's folks lined up here to join the webinar. We're grateful that you came, people from all over the country, probably, maybe even all over the world. And so we are glad you're joining us here. It's a little chilly here in the East Coast. I'm in Pennsylvania, and Steve's in Virginia. Hearts and Minds Bookstore, as many of you know, has been here about 43 years in a little town called Dallastown, which is just below York, Pennsylvania. Some of you have heard of York peppermint patties. That's us. And so we're in York, Steve's in Virginia, and we're getting together to chat about his brand new book called Hints of Hope. We've sent a lot of these out, and some of you have ordered them from us, our little independent bookstore here in Dallastown. So we're grateful for that. We're grateful to Paraclete Press, who's putting this together. They did a marvelous job creating Steve's book and editing it with him. We're glad for this publisher. I've worked with them before, and it's nice to see Steve in with Paraclete Press. So thank you to them who are recording this. We hope we can play it again later. It'll be recorded, we trust. So thank you all for joining us, and thank you, Steve, for being here. So I guess we should get into this conversation and talk about this great new book. You know I'm a fan. I've written about it a couple of times at Book Notes. Let me just start, if I could. I'll give you plenty of time to talk in a minute, my friend, but let me just highlight a couple of your other projects so people kind of have the framework of who you are. Some of your good friends know you well, but those that are new to this might just want to know that you wrote a book years ago called The Fabric of Faithfulness on InterVarsity Press. And I'm in this book. It's one of my great claims to fame. You interviewed me and a whole bunch of other people who were beginning to approach midlife and were still as idealistic and visionary for the kingdom of God as they were in their college years. And you ask them, what happened to you in those years? And you listen to people tell their stories of their transforming experiences in higher education and in their college years, what some thinkers call the critical years. And as you explored the critical years, you came up with three main principles that almost everybody said, stories that everybody reported. They were the three principles I said too. I didn't even know it till you put them all together. So this great book, The Fabric of Faithfulness by Steven Garber, is a gem, particularly about higher education, things our culture believes, and things that allow us to sustain faith over the long haul of our life. Well, then that very naturally led to this second book that Steve did called Visions of Vocation. Love the Van Gogh cover. It's still popular. It's still around. The subtitle is Common Grace for the Common Good. And it carries on some of those themes from Fabric about what kind of experience does one need to have in their faith life that's going to allow them to live seamlessly in the real world, in the brokenness of the world, once we see how the sausage is made, as you put it. Once we know how the sausage is made, we may give up our dreams and visions, our hopes and our expectations. We may grow jaded, we may grow cynical. And you say no. If you have visions of vocation, there's a way that can sustain you in the midst of carrying the weight of the world and live well for the kingdom of God. There's a chapter in this book, for those of you that haven't read it, you simply must, but there's a chapter in here about the proximate. And that is sort of the seed of some of Steve's new book, which we'll get to in a minute. After Visions of Vocation, he did a book called The Seamless Life, which I absolutely adore. There's photographs. It's almost like an on-the-road report live from his speaking and traveling from all over the world, particularly talking about this gap between Sunday and Monday and what we can do to live well as we relate liturgy and life, or as you put it here, a tapestry of love and learning, worship and work. Steve, I love this little book, as you know, and I recommend it highly, just as little snippets of people. Some of these were probably Facebook posts, I think, and the pictures are great. Did you have fun doing this? You
I
take a
sure
lot
did,
of
yeah.
neat
Yeah.
pictures.
Yeah.
I love this book. Well, those are the framework of things. He's written other chapters. He took an excerpt of a John Stott book and wrote a lovely foreword to it and put it out on missions. He did a chapter in my own book called Serious Dreams, where I collected commencement speeches, sending people out into the real world to serve. And Steve did a good chapter in there for us. So you've written a lot, but in a certain sense, I feel like this book, this new one, is maybe the culmination of a season in your life of writing these other things. You've been working on this thing a long time, haven't you?
For quite a few years, actually. I've called it a long labor of love.
Hmm. Well, it's more than just working on this book. You've lived this book for your whole life in a certain sense. Is there something like, I mean, not that the other ones aren't really important because they are, but there's something really special about this new book. I think it seems like a moment that is the fruition of a whole lot of years.
I mean, in many ways, Byron, because you and I are such long friends and conversation partners about all the things of life, you remember probably the early days of Comment magazine, and a friend of ours in common had come from South Africa and then come to Canada to study and then end up in Toronto. And he he said, Steve, you've been watching Washington, D.C. a long time. At that point, I had been. I've been teaching politics on Capitol Hill for many years and watching the sausage being made, as Lord Bismarck said about German society a century and a half ago. And he said, you've been watching Washington, D.C. for a long time. Is there a vocation in the political world? And I thought about it all summer long, and I gave him an essay that I called Making Peace with Proximate Justice. And it was really the first time I began to think about the world using that idea, that word, to make sense of what I had experienced for many years of my life already. Because I realized that you could be somebody in Washington, D.C., and the Londons and the, the Ottawas and the, Parises of the world are full of people who come into the capital cities wanting to put their shoulder to history, you know. But many don't last for very long because it just turns out to be too hard. They didn't think it'd be that difficult at all. And uh, I began to think, those who stay, though, who keep at it, who keep on keeping on, they seem to be people who are willing to make peace with having done something right, something true, uh, that's more than nothing. Um, and I use this image, which was, of course, is Augustinian in its deepest roots, of proximate justice. Would you be willing to give your life to doing something more honest, something more right, something more true? Well, that idea began to work its way in around my being for, 15 years or so. And so, as you're right, I wrote about it in the last chapter of the Visions book, and then I wrote about it in the last essay of the Seamless Life book as well. And when I were coming back from our years in Vancouver, British Columbia, I thought, I'd really like to give some years now to this idea of the proximate. So that's where it's come from.
Well, we're going to talk more about what you mean by that, but let's again just giving some people a flavor of what your life is like, your day to day. I mean, you've got grandkids and you live near Charlottesville, Virginia now, being close to some of your grandkids. But you have this sort of unique knack, Steve, for meeting interesting people. We even talked about this earlier today about your Iranian friends caught up in the seasons of their life. But geez, you sort of work as a consultant or a conversation partner, a guide. A consultant sounds too dry and businessy, but a friend to some very important nonprofit organizations, like the trust up in the Pacific Northwest, the Murdoch Charitable Trust. You worked with the Praxis Lab, which some people may have heard of. Even this Mars Corporation, the candy bar people, have pulled together a group to work on the mutuality of economics and economics of care and mutuality. And you've been a consultant and a conversation partner for some of these groups. Could you tell us just a little bit about any of those organizations, some of what you do when you're talking to the charitable trust people at Murdoch up in the Pacific Northwest, or when you're with the mutuality group in Singapore or something with the Mars Corporation of all people? What do you do day by day when you're doing this kind of conversation, teaching, uh, sharing with these important organizations that are making a difference? The Wedgwood Group is another that equips people to make films that make a difference, and art pieces, an artistic group named after Josiah Wedgwood, Wilberforce's friend. So you got your fingers in all this stuff. Tell us just a little bit about that.
I do what you would do, Byron, to put it simply. So if you were at the table, I would be just looking at you and say, that's exactly right, Byron. Go for it. Say more, please. I'm teasing a little bit, but not at all, really, because that's who you are. One of the groups, this Economics of Mutuality Project, which is born of this 100-year-old company owned by the family named Mars of all names. So it isn't just a pick out of a planet in the universe. It's actually a family with that name. But they've had a conscience more than some companies have had in their histories. And so 25 years ago, one of the owners of the company, one of them, Mr. Mars actually, asked the chief economist, who then drew me into a conversation about what's the right level of profit for us to make as a company. I'm going to give you the real short version of this, but we would say, well, is that even a question to ask, in the modern marketplace? I mean, wouldn't you always, every time, everywhere, make the most money you possibly can make? I mean, why are we even talking about this? But if you're a family-owned company, the question is not that question so much as it is, how do we keep making money? How do we sustain profitability? Because if we want to pass this business on to the next generation, how are we going to keep making money? What are the conditions required for a company like ours, which wants to stay in business? And that has to be more than simply maximizing shareholder profit, to put it quite simply. Uh, Byron, because we've talked about this. I drew these executives down with me to the farm of Wendell Berry a few years into this project, spending a whole day talking to him about our thinking and what this is what we have in mind. What do you think about this, Mr. Berry? And at the end of the day, he said something to us quite profound, which has lodged its way into my heart. He said, if you want to make money for 1 year, you ask certain questions, don't you? But you want to make money for 100 years, you ask other questions. Um, and I would say that, for that project, for Wedgwood, for the Murdoch Trust, whatever I'm doing, in the way that that's the economics mutuality folks put it to me. They say, Steve, you remind us of why we're doing what we're doing. So in some ways, I'm not a painter, I'm not a filmmaker, I'm not an economist, I'm not a this, I'm not a that. I'm a professor, I'm a teacher. I think about things. So in some ways, I'm drawn in to help people think about why they do what they do. And can you keep at it uh, over the years of your life?
And they keep asking you to come back because you dig deep into their story. When you're going somewhere to speak, this is maybe a little different, but when you're going somewhere to speak, you study Nashville or Memphis or Hollywood or Singapore, and you tell stories. You read novels. You've ordered them from us. You read a novel about that place just so you can get it in your bones as you're going to share. Some people would just do a one-off talk. They go somewhere and they give a speech and they leave, but you read novels about the place. Just remarkable. So as you're doing that kind of work, this proximate question comes up. You're working with people that are trying to change the world. Wedgwood making good films, or the Murdoch Trust investing in life-giving common grace ministries in the Pacific Northwest, or this Mars project of mutuality of economics that now has a think tanks in several big cities all over the world. You're doing this stuff, and so you're seeing the sausage made, and you realize some of this stuff does not work real well. It's not as easy as it sounds. Let's dream a dream and change the world. And so your voice there is one of talking about the proximate. And so then this book comes up. And I love even the cover. It's got this seashell on the front. And that sort of speaks volumes. When I saw the cover for the first time, I had read the manuscript and I thought, oh, the seashell story. It's right on the cover. Whoever thought of that's a great idea. And they did such a nice job with that watercolor. Tell us about why is there a seashell on a book about hope? And maybe you
Okay,
can even
good
read
question.
the very
It,
beginning of the book. Tell us about that, huh?
it's a good question, Byron. You'd have to look carefully, but it's there to be seen if you have eyes to see. But the painting is from a man who lives in another part of the world who's a very gifted watercolor painter. And we, with the good graces and persistence of Paraclete Press, persisted and found their way into his life. And a good question was asked. He finally said, yes, I'll participate in this book with you. Um, I wanted a shell that was beautiful, but broken at the same time. So you have to look carefully because you think, well, that's so beautiful, isn't it? Well, it is. But if you look carefully, you can see even in the very front part of the shell, there's a broken piece. Uh, that mattered a lot to me. Well, you and I talked a bit about this, and you thought, well, why don't you read a little bit? So maybe I'll read a little bit of the introduction just to introduce where this comes from.
If you were in our bookstore, Steve, that's what we would do. We would invite you to do a reading. So everybody listen up.
Broken alleluias. Even walking along the beach for the first hour of the morning, I think about the image of a broken alleluia. As my wife Meg said so plainly, so perceptively, you think about it out all the time. And I suppose I do. Step by step, I see the shells of the seashore washed by the waves, each one wonderfully imagined, intricately formed, and yet, not all that it could be and should be. So very beautiful, but broken too, like everything everywhere. Though in my heart of hearts I long for a different life, wanting with all that I am a different world. What I see is always marked by both joy and sorrow, never neat and clean, but instead somehow both at the same time. The work of my life is to find an honest way to live with both together. In another sense, more globally born, all of us work at that because, in some sense, we all have to, the world being what it is. And over the years, I wondered and wondered again, reading and reading more, living in and through the days of life, feeling the tension of what is and what is not in my very bones. What is clear to me is that there are some ways of seeing that resolve the tension by denying that there is a tension. But that's neither sufficient nor sustainable. The differences are real and they make a difference. All day long, we are confronted with both, and we have to somehow make sense of the world and our place in it, being honest about both what is glory and what is ruin. But why broken alleluias? The words from the poetic imagination of the singer-songwriter Leonard Cohen, and his words run through my very being. With an artful, haunting eloquence, the song wrestles with the tension of life, the beautiful and the broken together, open-hearted wonder and melancholic despair, a broken alleluia. Truth be told, I've been walking the beaches of the world for a long time, looking for a perfect shell, sauntering through the surf, hoping that sometime, someday, there will finally be. But what I find instead are hundreds and thousands of shells that seem just about perfect, but are not. So many, of course, are terribly broken, now only fragments of what they once were. In very different ways, they make me sigh. But the ones that trouble me are the ones that appear to be more than that seem to be perfect, until I stop and look more closely. The colors are always uniquely created, the shapes are always uniquely crafted. And from 6 feet away, they're amazingly beautiful. But when I bend over, the cracks are obvious. The almost perfect outline is not quite. The holes stand out, and I find that each one is uniquely marred. I first thought of this walking along the Assateague National Seashore in Virginia many years ago, there to take part in the wedding of dear friends. They'd asked me to give the homily to muse over the meaning of marriage, as they made their promises to honor and love till death do us part. So I did my best to celebrate the day, glorying with them in the happiness of the hour, standing as they were amidst family, friends, and flowers, with hopes in their heart, hope in their hearts. But given where we were, I also reflected on the shells. I knew each one is so very special, but each one a reminder that nothing is perfect. Wonderful as they were, wounded they were too. Like every marriage I know, like every family I know, like every life I know, from the most personal to the most public, nothing we know is perfect in every way, and only the naive imagine otherwise. Slowly, slowly, we all realize that we have to make peace with the proximate. And simply said, that is the challenge of my life, of proximate justice in the public square, of proximate happiness in a marriage, of proximate pleasure in the work of our days. Every day I cry out against that conclusion, yearning for something more, my inward being groaning with creation itself, and eventually sighing over the weight of the world, knowing that everything is less than it could be and should be. As Bob Dylan has said, has so poetically and profoundly remembered, everything is broken. Broken dishes, broken parts, broken streets filled with broken hearts. Yes, everything is broken. As true as that is for individual lives, it's true for the public square too, as it is true for the work and workplaces of our lives, as it's true for the friendships and marriages of our lives. All day long, I live with disappointment and grief and pain, like everyone I know well enough to know. And while I live my life wanting more, expecting more, to remember another poet, Bono, I never find what I'm looking for. And why is that? Because I'm a glorious ruin myself. In my heart and mind, I'm never more and never less than that. Both truths threading their way through the fabric of my life. And with strange grace, what is true of me is true of the world. Even the shells have a story to tell if we have eyes to see.
It's just beautiful writing, Steve. It's profound. It's a simple insight, but exceedingly important because most people don't get it. So that's why I love this book and I love your message and I love your work. And you've obviously attended to the craft of writing. There's some alliterations in there, there's some lovely sentences. So thank you for that. Thank you, Steve.
You're welcome.
One of the ways that I think this is rubbed off on you, this good writing, this poetic style, this eloquence, is because you do pay attention to artists and to singers and to writers. Can I jump ahead to a theme that appears in the book throughout? And for those that don't know, Steve cites novels, Charles Dickens, Václav Havel essays, important writers, but also poets and artists and singer-songwriters and filmmakers. You have a section where you talk about taking your kids to movies. It's called The Father I Am and the Films I Love. Can I read a little part? We've heard you read. I'm going to read just a little part. It's sort of a whimsical part here, but you say, over the years, your kids saw all kind of movies with me. An after-school surprise for the box office opening of Jurassic Park on Washington, D.C.'s grandest screen. The T-Rexes chasing us across the theater. An evening together with the playfully, theatrically rich Much Ado About Nothing, Shakespeare's classic made film with Kenneth Branagh, Emma Thompson, Denzel Washington, and many more. Laughing when they laughed, crying when they cried. An intense afternoon with my sons, The Weight of Seven, with its macabre account of the seven deadly sins, with hope that we could think about true evil in a culture of whatever. Pondering the wonderful beauty of marital intimacy and Rob Roy, amidst the grandeur of the Scottish Highlands and the sword fighting extraordinaire. The White Rose, too, with its story of university students who responded to the horror of the Holocaust with remarkable courage, bringing beliefs about the way the world should be to bear upon their moment of time, and so many more. So you take your kids to movies. You like movies. You talk about movies in all of your books. And then you start talking about this guy named Malick. Many know him, Terrence Malick. And you say that he did this film called The Tree of Life. Fabulous, mystical, profound artistic film. And then he did another one called The Hidden Life, about a German peasant named Franz Jagerstatter. We've carried his books about him in the store forever, who resisted Hitler. And you compare and contrast these two books. So let me read a paragraph and ask you to tell us what made you think of this, how you brought these things together. You say what Malick offers in this story is the gift of a greater story, an eschatological hope that Franz believes in with all his heart. As weighty as his day becomes, that he sees them as now, but not yet, and it allows him to live facing the horror that is before him. Of course, that's Nazism. Franz Jägerstätter had hope and lived in this now and not yet. And you say that Malick's telling of that story is connected to his Tree of Life story. How do you bring those two movies together? Tell us about how you interpret films, how these two films say something about the project you're working on in this book.
That's a very good question, Byron. Um, well, you know that I've been a great student, very attentive student of Walker Percy's, the American novelist and essayist. And years ago, I came across lines which just jumped off the page of an essay. He made the argument that bad books lie. They lie most of all about the human condition. And essentially arguing that whatever your world and worldview you might be looking through in terms of a particular novel, whoever it is, wherever it is written in the world, that the story is always a story about what it means to be human. And Percy's insight, which I thought was quite profound and weighty, was that actually a good book tells the truth about the human condition. A bad book tells a lie about the human condition. Um, Now, that's debatable, and we could talk about it. And Percy, in his own essays, pushes that out and with great insight sort of argues in all these universes next door, one by one by one by one. He says, well, this falls short here, and this falls short here, and this one falls short here. Now, I'm not going to defend his thesis here, other than to say I believe it quite deeply. So when I watch Terrence Malick as a filmmaker, I walk into a film. I always have either open in my mind about it or implicitly written into my very being is what's it going to do with what it means to be human? Who are we in this story? What's it going to be here? Um, well, if you know the Tree of Life, it's set in a little town in Texas and a little family in the 1950s. It looks like in the beginning of the film, and they live on an ordinary street and they're ordinary people. But the story, as it's told, takes them through the most wonderful moments and the most terrible moments in human life. Uh, I won't ruin the story for anybody other than to say it won the Cannes, which is for most of us who don't speak French, we think it looks like Cannes to me, say Cannes, but it's the biggest film festival in the world. It happens once a year in France. And when Malick took that film to Cannes, he won the gold prize for the whole year, the best film of the world that year. What's remarkable is that the story, as it's set in an ordinary place with ordinary people, is a story situated in Augustinian theology. You'd have to have eyes to see, but if you do, you'd think, really, Malik, you're going to tell a story framed by this great story, this meta narrative of creation, of fall, of redemption, of consummation. And there are four great moments, four chapters in the film that Malik offers in the Tree of Life. And they are that story all the way through from beginning to end. Now, differently done, in A Hidden Life, the story of Franz Jagenstarter, it's so beautiful. It's maybe the most beautiful film I've ever seen in my life. I mean, it's gorgeously set in the grandeur of the Austrian Alps. You think, if I could just go there and do something, I would be a happier man, I'm sure, really. But it's a story set in early 1940s, and um, he um, he's a farmer. He has a wife and some children, and um, and the Nazis come to town eventually, come into Austria. Um, and he is, under some duress, decides, in fact, that he will sign up his name to join the National Guard. And but then they say, okay, Franz, but you need to Heil Hitler too. He says, I can't do that. Why? I don't believe that. Um, Now, I won't ruin the story other than to say that that becomes the drama of the story. And the reason that Franz is willing and able to walk his way through to the end of the story is because he believes in a bigger story. He believes
Yeah.
in a story that makes sense even of suffering and terror and horror and awfulness. But he realizes that even in the groaning that is his, that isn't the end of the story he believes to be true about all of history and the whole cosmos. So that's the dynamic of the story. And that's what draws me in. And that's why I love the films and that's why I wrote about the films there.
And you compare them and contrast them in this book. Steve's book is sort of meandering. It goes off in these little tangents, if you will, and then they always come back together. It's a good quality in a writer, not a bad quality. But your little film reviews that then weave back into the narrative of that chapter. But just in case you're thinking, well, Cannes Film Festival and world class obscure art films is what Garber always talks about. No, he talks about Pixar movies too. And so let me read this paragraph that you continue on. You say, from Song to Malick to Pixar and more, the best movies are always more because we see that ideas have legs in the world in which we all live. Seeing and hearing out of our hearts as we do, our hearts being formed by pre theoretical commitments that are so deep within us that we cannot live any other way. We live out of our loves, whether we intend to or not, whether we believe we do or not. The challenge is to be folk who choose well, finding our deepest and truest selves in beliefs that are true to the way the world really is, to make sense of our longing for a morally meaningful universe. And push come to shove, that give us the courage to live with an integrity of heart and mind that holds on to our humanity, making peace with something that is more beautiful, something that is more true, making peace with the proximate in and through the days of our lives. Again, just a beautiful summary, Steve, of this story about film and about the Tree of Life and about this resistance to Hitler. And then the Pixar movies that are fun as well. And they all have something to say as we deep down absorb their visions. Because it's out of the heart we live, you say. Pre theoretical commitments. What do you mean by that? Pre theoretical commitments. So that's a mouthful.
You and I have been thinking about that idea for most of our lives now, Byron. Um, Uh, it's easy to think, well, if you just read the right books, go to the right lectures, have the right degree, or I heard this one day, or I took this in, I think this way. Well, maybe you do, but I think the deeper story about each of us is that in the Hebrew view of what it means to be human, it begins with the heart. Hebrew anthropology, we could describe it that way, and centered in the heart. So we live out of our hearts. We think and see and hear and feel out of our hearts. We're not primarily minds. That's more Greek than it is Hebrew, to put it in a contrast like that. We are heart-centered people. My dear friend Davy Noggle called us cardio-optic people. We see out of our hearts. Um, and so pre-theoretical means that in some ways, before I'm even aware of having thought about something, I've already committed myself. I've already made decisions about what I think to be true and not true in the world. Uh, Before I've even in some ways weighed in, theoretically, my idea is this, my belief is this. The deeper story for you, Byron, for me, for everyone on this call, is in fact that in the heart of hearts, we've already committed ourselves to a certain way we see and understand what reality is, what the world is all about. That's a pre-theoretic commitment.
Yeah. Yeah. Jamie Smith wrote that popular book called You Are What You Love. Again, an Augustinian line asking the great bishop of the early church or the fourth century church, how do you know who is a real Christian or something, in the debates about heresy? And he said, well, don't ask people what they believe, ask what they love. That's how you get at what somebody's really about, this deepest question that you've articulated. And I think that's probably why you, Steve, draw on the arts so much, because our deepest commitments are not merely cognitive. I mean, you're a philosopher, you're a scholar, so you're not discounting the life of the mind, but the mind, there's something pre-theoretical that's deeper that has to do with what we might want to call the imagination. And so you draw on storytellers and dreamers. One of the great pieces you write about, Steve, then in the next section is about music, and you talk about Wynton Marsalis from New Orleans, That's a great little piece. And he comes up with this piece of music called the Jubilee Suite, which you tell about. Let me just read. I'd ask you to read it, but I've got a page open right here with a posting note. So I'll read this. You say, what is his music, Wynton's, growing up in New Orleans? Remarkably able to play across genres, he threads jazz of every kind through his work. But he also has offered his trumpet to the work of Bach and Beethoven, Mozart, and Vivaldi. And at a profound level, the blues, too, are written into his understanding of the art of his life. Of the latter, he intriguingly writes, the blues was not just a musical form, it was a rich legacy that is part of our national identity as Americans. It was only later that I began to recognize that the blues trains you for life's hurdles with a heavy dose of realism about life and love and pain and death and stupidity and grace. Isn't that a great quote from this great classical jazz blues trumpetist, Wynton Marsalis? And he says that the blues is a heavy dose of realism about life and love and pain and death and stupidity and grace. That's your thesis, right? He gets it.
He
And
gets it.
then he talks after these hundreds of albums he's done, this Jubilee Suite. What is that? What is that about?
I was surprised, of course, by given our long pilgrimage through the jubilees of this world, to come across this music years ago, thinking, really, Wynton Marsalis has written about this. He has a composition, the Jubilee Suite, and a lot can be said. I'll try to give you the shortest version, but it's in three parts. The first part of the suite is sort of the most beautiful, jazzy, bluesy, deep, deep horns and longer, lingering notes. You think, that's so beautifully done, Marsalis. And then slowly that beauty begins to push and shove a bit and becomes disintegrated and becomes fragmented. And you think, I don't like that kind of music that much, actually, because it grates on my soul. It's not good for me to listen to that very long. And that goes on for a while. And then slowly, slowly, that begins to come back together again in a renewed vision. In fact, a way to understand, he calls that last part of the suite grace. Uh, And so he puts together, in some ways, his own meta narrative, looking at a deeper, bigger, larger, grander story with these three parts to it of maybe a world that was meant to be, a world that, ought to be, the world that so painfully we feel it is this, it is too much this, and I don't like this really. And then slowly, not easily done, but slowly beginning to put together again something which he simply titles grace. It's a way to hear and to believe and understand and to see, in fact, that is born of, this inexplicable idea, which we call amazing grace.
Yeah. That you pull these, I don't want to say obscure, but these very interesting pieces together. The next paragraph, you remind us that Bono had a song called Grace, which itself is its own common grace, is gospel grace, actually. Boy, what a song that is, too. So these themes of goodness and brokenness and hope are woven through many artists that you describe, whether it's film or whether it's jazz or whether it's Bono and U2. It's pretty darn cool, Steve. I love how you do this. Do you listen to a lot of music?
Oh, not all the time, but a good bit of the time. Yeah.
Yeah. And a variety of styles and kinds, right?
You'd be surprised. I do. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. You have a story of a friend of yours who was raised Muslim, and he played Bach. He was learning Bach on the flute. You tell the story, and his teacher said, "You got all the notes right, but you can't play Bach unless you understand the cross of Christ." What a story that was! Of this guy then finding his own way to the grace of Jesus through playing Bach well. But you listen to classical, you listen to jazz, and you listen to Mumford and Sons, and you listen to U2. So I'm right with you there, Steve. I love how music can speak to this and capture our imaginations in ways that maybe just good essays can't. As much as I love good essays and good books, but there's something about the power of music and the arts. You talk about the arts a lot, actually. Mako Fujimura, an abstract painter and friend of yours, wrote the foreword, and Mako himself, you talk about in the book a bit. So it's nice that he gave a rave review in the introduction, a very nicely written piece. Um, do you remember what you said about Mako, his style of art, and something he wrote about him and his process, and how that kind of carried the argument of the book along?
You might be surprised, but I actually do remember Byron. Um, but it's a
Yeah.
chapter called Wounds and Scars, and it begins with me reflecting on a great wound in my own life, a bike accident I had when I was 20. I ripped apart my Achilles tendon. It was severed when the surgeon looked at it the next day. It was completely torn apart. And so the chapter begins there with looking at the reality very physically, very really, very in the blood and flesh, looking at wounds and scars. But then it moves in that introductory piece in the chapter to looking more at the wider world and how, in fact, we can't live in the world, any of us, without being wounded people. It's a wounded world. What are you going to do with that then? And that we will be scarred because that's what we live in. We don't leave the scars behind either, that we will be scarred in this world. But then the chapter moves from Abraham Lincoln's and his, speeches and his life to Martin Luther King and, to a friend of mine, a physician in Pittsburgh who does his work among the street people of Pittsburgh, under the bridges of Pittsburgh, and his own wounded healer as a physician. Then the last part of the chapter draws Mako in, actually, in his own great work as a painter and my conversation with him over the years. But then it ends with me writing a little bit about him and his discovery in the last 10 years or so of an ancient Japanese technique called kintsugi. Uh, and some of you would know it, some of you maybe have gone to seminars on this yourselves, but it's essentially to say, rather than throwing out this beautiful porcelain bowl or whatever you have here, that was broken, what about if we would actually put it back together again? And in this ancient artistic practice, which has its own practical end of his own Japanese culture, it is to take a particular kind of very delicate, very strong, gold-born glue, I suppose it is, and putting piece by piece by piece the bowl or the cup back together again. And um, he calls this the art of precious scars. And for me, that is um, beautifully a part of what I meant to explore in this chapter on wounds and scars, and to say, well, it is a wounded, broken, you know, it's a broken world. Of course it is. None of us can pretend otherwise. But in this world where that isn't the end of the story, uh, is it possible actually to put something broken back together again? Even with the scars being there, visible to all of us with eyes to see. And yet there can be remarkably, sort of powerfully, a beauty in the brokenness.
Yeah. That illustration of that art kind of art is become a sermon illustration people have used these days. I see it in other books. And I don't mean to sound derogatory, but sometimes it sounds a little cheap, too quick, too easy. Oh, God will heal it. It becomes beautiful. Scars become beautiful. Part of the story. But as you describe it, there's an intensity, Steve, that you capture the brokenness like that in Wynton Marsalis suite that you don't want to hear that middle part. It does great. And so your telling of the story of this art piece and of Mako's use of it really worked for me. It was a tender and I don't want to say anguishing, but it felt real. You never write anything cheap. There's no easy answers. So when you tell a story like that, unlike some authors that may just sort of whip it out as an illustration of something, you are indwelling this. I won't ask amongst our many friends here about your own personal pain, but we both know that all of us carry certain weights and brokenness, like that scar from your own accident. So there's an intensity to your work. Do you ever worry that people think your book is dour, or that it's broken hallelujahs, that there's too much negativity or something? One of our guests here that are writing, and if anybody wants to write any questions and write in that little chat there, but one of our guests said, maybe if we don't see the flaws, we would even have nothing to aspire to. We wouldn't want to hope, and we wouldn't even feel alive then. Like if everything was just perfect, or you didn't notice that anything was wrong, how would you even aspire to anything? So maybe there is some insight there about seeing, you don't appreciate the beauty of the sunrise until you've lived in the darkness a while. Do you worry ever that people, I don't know, think you're dwelling too much on the dark stuff?
I don't think about it at all, Byron, actually. Um, I think given what I've done with my life over many years of my life, I've walked into so many rooms with people all over the country and the world for years and years, and I've come to the conclusion that everybody in the room bears a wound.
Hmm.
We may not talk about it that night, may not talk about the particular grief or sorrow or disappointment which is theirs. Probably we won't because it don't seem quite right there and then. But I've come to believe, as much as I believe anything really, that everybody I meet, every room I walk into, everyone is wounded. And I want actually, this is a desire I have, but I think about and pray about and think it through actually before I'm speaking. I want people actually to understand that when they hear me speak, they know that I live in the same world they do.
Okay. Yeah. In that section, I think I mentioned a certain intensity or quality of realism there. It's a beautiful thing, Steve. But you also link it, and Mako does as well, to the tears of Jesus. It becomes not just like we have to be real because everybody's hurting, and so it's all just that's the facts. Everybody's wounded, but in the carrying of those wounds, there's something deeply spiritual going on. It's a Christological moment where Jesus himself was wounded. So this is sort of, in a certain sense, the profoundest mark of the book is that we can only hope for the proximate, and that's okay if we make peace with the proximate, because we are wounded. But that's the heart of Jesus, of carrying our wounds, of himself being wounded. You tell the story of him weeping in anger even over the death of his friend Lazarus. Can you talk about the spirituality of tears, the deeper level in which Jesus shares our wounds and bears our wounds as a wounded Savior?
Yeah.
I know that's a big topic, but
Huge
you
question.
write about it in the book. So
And
how do you bring Jesus
I've
to
written it
this?
about several times, actually, as I think about your question. I know there's a chapter that begins, sometimes there are tender tears, and that's a different question. That's a different chapter. Um, uh, well, when Marco took me around his gallery in New York City some years ago, he wanted to show me this whole collection he'd done for the 400th anniversary edition of the King James New Testament, the Bible. And um, and we spent several hours just walking painting by painting by painting just to say, this is this one, this is this one. I finally said, Marco, what's this one? And he said, well, um, I I call this the Tears of Christ. I looked at him and I said, you do? What is it? He said, well, it's John 11. And I said, Marco, really? And well, I wrote about it in the book, and I won't tell everything about it right here, but um, I'd never met anybody in my life up to that point who'd seen John 11 as I'd seen John 11, which surprising for the two of us standing there together in front of his painting. We both had come to the conclusion many years ago, in our 20s, in fact, that if that chapter wasn't in the Bible, we didn't see how we could become Christians, how we would be Christians, because it mattered so much, a line in the sand in terms of the basic possibility of faith, that if God didn't cry over, in fact, weep over, in fact, be enraged over with his tears, the wounds of the world, how could we be interested? I know that I wasn't interested. I knew that I couldn't be interested. And I never met anybody until Mako said, well, that's what the painting's about, Steve. And we had come to the conclusion before we'd ever even knew of each other existed in the world, when we were still in our own emerging critical years of life in our 20s, thinking, well, but if that one isn't in the Bible, I don't want to be a Christian. I couldn't be a Christian because I can't go along with that kind of uh, cheap faith as both of us saw it. Um, so that's part of that chapter, and it's something which drew us more deeply together, and it's in some ways why I felt like it was okay to ask him to write the foreword for the book, because I knew that in a profound level, very differently put together as a person, very wonderfully gifted in his own completely in the uniqueness of his all of history way, Marco is, but that we'd come to the same conclusion.
There's a little bit of a digression here, but I have to share it. You mentioned that Mako wrote a book, which many of us would know, about the Japanese novelist Endo, called The Silence. It's one of the most powerful novels about priests in Japan back centuries ago who were persecuted and martyred for their faith. And God did not solve that problem, did not save them. And so Endo, a contemporary 20th century person writing in Nagasaki, writes this novel, Silence. When Martin Scorsese, the Catholic filmmaker, decides he wants to make a film of that book that he loved, he somehow meets Mako and draws on his Christian experience of coming to Christian faith in Nagasaki. And Mako writes a book called Silence and Beauty, again,
Right.
about the beauty of God's silence, or the beauty of this horrific movie. And Scorsese sort of draws on Mako as a consultant for the film, and then Mako writes a book about the making of the film and the reading of the novel, Silence and Beauty. Again, it captures so much of what you're about, Steve, this carrying the weight of the theological question of theodicy. Where is God in the pain? And yet finding beauty there somehow. So I love that you drew on Mako in that book, and the story that Mako tells in that book about Endo's novel. Again, linking together the arts, the novelist, the painter. And then you link Arvo Part in the middle of that, the Russian Orthodox classical composer, neoclassical composer, and you talk about Arvo Part's work. So that chapter is just worth the price of the book. It's really, really good.
Thank
We
you.
have a comment here from somebody, in fact, who's thanking us and agreeing with many of your comments, Steve. And somebody asks, can we make art without seeing the wounds or the flaws or the brokenness or our limitations? Is there work without that sees the gaps between what is and what we long to be? So this person's asking, isn't this not part of the artistic vocation? Can we even make art if we don't see the flaws? I would probably say, yeah, you can make art. It just would be bad art.
Well, that was
You know,
Walker,
the
point, of course. I mean, bad books, what? They lie most of all about the human condition. So there is never a story to be honestly told, which doesn't somehow honestly, even beautifully, artfully, gracefully wrestle with both the glory and the ruin. That's why I drew in the Pixar films as an example of that, Byron, because we could name them one by one here, whether it's Cars or whether it's you know uh,
Yeah.
you could just I named a whole handful of them there in the chapter. I mean, what makes Cars a story that when it came out, 20 years ago, every 4-year-old little boy and girl, maybe boy especially, but I don't know, I heard about for some boys, wanted to see it today and tomorrow and the next day too. They just wanted to watch it again and again. And you think, well, how could this be? This is really, if you know what the world's really like, this is Wendell Berry for 5-year-olds. Because it's
Yeah.
about what people in place. It's about why they matter to human beings. But somehow Pixar's genius filmmaking allowed even 4-year-olds to think, I love that story. And I
Yeah.
want that story again and again and again. Now, it isn't because, Lightning McQueen wins all the races. In fact, he's devastated. He loses, some things. And in fact, he makes a choice at the very end of the story to lose the biggest race in his life. Why? Because of what's happened to him through the people and place of Radiator Springs. So there's nothing, nothing, to use a maybe too much of a throwaway line here, nothing Pollyannish about the story, like
Yeah.
where it all just sort of smiles in the end, you know. But in fact, there's something we have to wrestle with disappointment and hurt and loss and grief. And yet, before it's all over, something deeper and truer and more beautiful happens. And that, I would say, whether you're a 5-year-old or whether you're a 50-year-old, those are the stories we want to hear more often than not.
Yeah. Yeah. And one person contributed here suggesting that that was the genius of Flannery O'Connor, too, the great Catholic novelist who saw the dark stuff as pointing to some signal of transcendence, something bigger and better going on. So even the dark stuff has a place to play in the telling of these great stories.
Yeah.
Um, you call this notion of coping with the realities of our fallen world um, by limiting our expectations. Maybe that's not a good way to put it, but by making peace with the proximate of realizing we can't have it all in this world, but we can live honestly and well by making some difference, even if we can't change it all. That you call that a gift. Near the end of the book, in that Wounds and Scars chapter, in fact, you call it the gift of the proximate. And you say, I'm going to quote you, you say, the only way to keep our hearts alive in this fallen world, in this messy, broken world, the only way to keep our hearts alive is to make peace with the proximate. Let me read one more part from this. You say, apart from the gift of the proximate, we have no way of keeping our hearts alive, either as persons or as polities, either as human beings who long for healing or as cities and societies who stumble and stumble again over systemic wrongs that generations cannot unravel. To find a way forward requires that we see ourselves and the world truthfully, being honest about what is, at the same time hoping for the day when all will be real and true and right. It is an expectation of the future which actually shapes the way we live into the wounds that otherwise only damage or debilitate, making us feel stuck in moments that we can never quite get out of because we cannot make sense of the senselessness of the sorrow, the ache of the tension we live with being so great that we cannot even see a way forward. Whew, that needs to be read a couple of times. I've underlined it a couple of times. To find a way forward with a sense of hope in the future is the only way to stay alive in this fallen world. Can you unpack that sentence just a little bit more?
I'm just looking at you, my dear friend, that you are, and thinking, Byron, you live this way all day long. And you have, I mean, I know you well enough to know that, even this morning and this day and this night, you will have to be making choices in the light of, of great wound, of unknowns, things you don't know what next week will bring, and 3 months from now, you don't know of the things you love most of all in your whole life. You don't know what tomorrow will bring. And and yet, I think all of us who know you, who love you as we do, we would say, well, Byron, he keeps at it. He keeps at it. He keeps at it, and again. And I've said to you and to other people, the word proximate isn't a magic word. It can't be that. You can choose your own word, But I would say that we need a word like that to keep our hearts alive. Because there has to be some way that you can, you know, make some sense of the wounds of the world, the brokenness of history, uh, the hurts and wounds and sorrows of your own life. I thought about the word proximate actually as a prism into the tension between the meta narrative and narrative in everyone's life. Between what we sense, this is the big story of all of life and reality, and yet here's the frailty of Byron Borger's life and Steve Garber's life today on Tuesday. You know, so how do you put together the hope, the frailty of your life and mine with what we think, well, the big story is this story, actually. Well, apart from becoming sort of ending the night in despair, thinking, I have no way to access that because it's the hurt is too much today, you know. But then, of course, that's why I'm drawn into that Franz Jachenstadter story too, as a filmic, window into, somebody who's facing the worst of the worst of the worst of history and decides to not give up. Decide, in fact, to keep loving God and loving his wife, even in the face of the worst of the worst of the worst. It's not cheap because it can't be that. Um, but that's what the calling, or I would use this good word that you and I live with, that is the vocation of all of us.
Yeah. Well put. One of our friends writing in here uses the phrase, and you've used it already, but I'm just going to say it so that everyone hears it again, that we have this understanding of the kingdom of God, of Jesus' will being done on earth as it is in heaven, that it is now and not yet. Jesus said the kingdom is here, but yet it is not fully consummated. And that's the future in which we hope that there is some really real truth that the kingdom of God has arrived, but yet it is not fully arrived. And so that now and not yet is a phrase that somebody just suggested. He said he was quoting from the article that Gideon had you write in comment, and knowing Sean Purcell as I do, he probably did look up that article right away and knows it by heart. So that now and not yet phrase is one that resonates too, doesn't it?
It is.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, again, there are different ways to put that. That's one of the best ways I know of to get at that. Quite close to that is the phrase already, but not yet. Um,
Already, but not yet.
we live in that tension, all of us, all day long. Those of us who were born of this deeper story from creation to consummation, we think, well, yes, it started here. This terribly happened in all of history, and the whole of the universe was affected by it. Everything is broken. That's not cheap to say because it's a hard thing to have to say out loud. Uh, and yet, we think that something has happened to make it not be different. I mean, it is why Bono says so poetically, grace is more than a name for a girl. It's a thought that changed the world. Uh,
Yeah.
if that isn't true, then we all ought to go home. Well, in some ways, that was what drew me to Mako in that painting, thinking, Mako, you think this too about John 11? I've never met anybody in my life who's read that chapter in the same way. It's been like a line in the sand in all of the Bible. If that one is not in the Bible, how could we possibly want to be a Christian? If God himself doesn't weep over both tenderly and with rage over the wrongness of death. Uh, Even as we hope and hope in all of our hearts with our, father of all literary best stories in the world, Tolkien, who says, wonderfully, someday, Mr. Frodo, all sad things will become untrue.
Yeah. There are some hobbits in this book, and you tell some Tolkien stories. You even talk about meeting the actors, as Sean Astin, I think is his name, that played Sam in the Lord of the Rings movies. You talk early on about that, but then in chapter 8, you have a pretty lengthy quote from Tolkien as kind of a epigram in the beginning of the chapter. Can I read that?
Please
This
do.
is this is Tolkien now, everybody. This isn't Steve, but Steve is citing this. It's like in the great stories, Mr. Frodo, the ones that really mattered. Full of darkness and danger they were. And sometimes you didn't want to know the end, because how could the end be happy? You would want the world to go back to the way it was so bad. You want to go back to the way it was when so much bad had happened. But in the end, it's only a passing thing, this shadow. Even darkness must pass. A new day will come. And when the sun shines, it will shine out the clearer. Those were the stories that stayed with you. That meant something, even if you were too small to understand why. But I think, Mr. Frodo, I do understand. I know now. Folk in those stories had lots of chances of turning back, but they didn't. They kept going because they were holding on to something, that there is something good in this world and it's worth fighting for.
Mm.
That's a great quote. You then move to a little meditation on the word sauntering from John Muir, I think. And so they're pilgrims on this Lord of the Rings journey. And you also talk about them sauntering. Well, are we pilgrims? Are we all hobbits, really? Are we sauntering? And is that a fun thing, an adventurous thing? We've talked a lot about the woundedness of the world, but there's some pleasantness to all this, too, isn't there?
There's both, and that's of course who you are, and it's who I want to be, Byron, in life. If you could see around the corner of this computer right now, you can see in the entryway to our house a little table with a beautiful painting, some Southwestern artist. Uh, um, uh, but then on the table, there are some original books by John Muir that I found over the years that are prizes to me. Um, John Muir, I grew up in California. He was the patron saint of California. There was John Muir Elementary School and high school, and John Muir this and John Muir that, and John Muir Woods and John Muir Sierra Club and everything. John Muir. Nobody was quite like John Muir in California. Um, but I didn't know until, some many years later that in fact, he was raised as by a mother and father who actually believed that God was God and that this was the world made by God. That was never part of anybody's official Oxford Press biography of John Muir at all. They left that story out kind of incredibly. Um, um, but he memorized the whole of the New Testament by the time he was 11 years old. Think about that. A third of the Old Testament by the time he was 11 years old. He'd memorized them, you know. Uh, anyway, he goes to America when he's 12, and it's a longer story, but eventually gets to Yosemite, to what we now call Yosemite because it wasn't at the time, and he begins to write about it, and the rest of America begins to learn about it through his writing, and eventually he becomes a older man with a long white beard and his own staff that he walks through the hundreds of miles of the Sierras with. But he says this out loud at a certain point that history has remembered. He says, I don't hike through the Sierra Nevadas, I saunter through them. He says, I don't even like the word hike, actually. It isn't even a word I even use in my life. I saunter through these mountains. He says, do you know what the word saunter means? And of course, none of us do. It's a rhetorical question. He says, well, and this is a little bit of a debated question, but there are some etymological, reasons for this. I would say I've read and read and read about it. He says, in the Middle Ages, the medieval period, when the pilgrims were on their way to what they called the Holy Land, going through the Romance states of France, and Italy, and Portugal, and all. He said they were asked, "Where are you going?" And they would say in some version of the language, "A la Santa Terra," to the Holy Land. Um, and says eventually these people began to be known as the Saunterers. Uh, so he says, in my own life, 1,000 years later, here I walk through the Sierra Nevadas. I saunter through these mountains. This is my holy land. This is my holy ground. Um, so I have taken that image to heart, Byron, and thinking, well, in whatever it is that God gives you and me to do and anybody else to do in this life, could we actually have eyes to see, in fact, that this too is the world that God made, as Muir did, and actually have eyes to see the fact that this too is something to love, to care for, to know well enough to love deeply enough. And that really, as you know from other things you and I've talked about over the years, that is the substance of what vocation means for every one of us, to both know and to love the world at the same time. So more to say, but that's a little bit.
That's such a great story. Um, and Tolkien fits into that too, right? They're pilgrims on the way in their adventure.
I am a hobbit. Anybody who knows me knows enough about me to know that, the world of, you know, of having to have identifiers to get into all the computer, worlds of this world, somehow, somewhere, I'm another hobbit again in my life. So I'm not anything other than that wherever I go. So
Well, I think we need to sort of begin to bring this to a close. If anybody has any final questions, put them in the little comment thing here. Oh, there's a Q&A button here too we're supposed to click on. They told us about that. So let me click on this Q&A thing and see if there's anything, Steve, anybody wants to ask. What was the most unexpected lesson you learned yourself while writing this book? That's a good question. Thank you, Howard.
Thank you, Howard. I'll see you on Friday, by the way. Um, Unexpected lesson. Um, I think I don't know if I can put it, if I give you that answer, Howard. I would say that so much of my life is in the language of, C.S. Lewis. I experience it as further up and further in. Um, so, if this question of the proximate, came to me 15 years ago in an essay, well, Byron knows me well enough to know that for most of my life, I've been wrestling with the same question of how do you keep going? How do you keep at it? How do you not just say, well, I believe these things now when I'm 21, but about when you get to be 31 and 41 and 51? Can you deepen the commitments and loves that have marked you as a younger person into the rest of your life? Or will you decide after 5, 10 years, well, I'm not 21 anymore, and begin to discard the commitments and loves that once made you be you? My question has always been, well, what does it take to actually to deepen them instead? So for me, I would say this book is another deepening, another further up and further into these long questions of my life.
Yeah. And it is shaped, as one of our commenting friends just said, that it is, in a certain sense, shaped by the culture in which we live now. There's a certain polarization and pain and weirdness in politics that feels bad. And you don't address that directly too much, but yet you're very aware of the injustices of this world, Steve, and your comments about your global friends. There's so many global figures in this book, people from Eastern Europe, people from Asia. There's stories from Africa. There's stories from South America. Your chapter about Birmingham, Alabama, and your time with the commemoration of the bombing of the Birmingham church there so many years ago. Well, what a great global picture this is. Is there a reason that you went out of your way to tell stories of people that aren't just North Americans?
Yeah, there is. I grew up in a farming town in California, so in some ways I still feel like I belong there. Um, and yet I don't. I've lived in Washington, D.C. for 35 years now. It's a long life actually to be in one city for a long time and teaching politics of all things in Washington, D.C. for many years of my life. But I would say that, it is clear to me now, looking at the years I've lived, that I have surprising enough surprises, gotten to know a lot of the world. I've been to all the places to all the different continents and gotten to know honest people who are honestly my friends, in all these different places. I wanted to write a book for them, Byron. I wanted to write a book where Africans could say, well, I see myself in this stuff because he's written about me here. I wanted to have my Asian friends say, there I am too. I wanted to have my Latin American friends said, huh, there I am too. So I purposely, knowing that other books I've written have been published around the world in other languages and other cultures, I wanted to have this book be very purposely for the rest of the world. So I thought about this carefully, not wanting to be silly about it, but I wanted to make sure that, in fact, that the world could see itself in what I wrote.
That's a noble aspiration. It's a good thing to do. And it is your experience. These are not stories you just had to scour in the internet or something. These are your friends. And you've
Yeah.
been drawn into their lives and you've seen their struggles and you report them well. So thank you for doing that. Um, I think as we sort of come to a close here, there's many comments, Steve. I don't know if you're looking at them, but people are thanking you for your words and saying this is helpful. And some people have read the book already. I hope they can order it if they haven't yet. But there's just a question or two if we have just a little more time. One guy asked a question, and this is sort of part of your grand work that you do, helping people relate, marketplace ministry, as some call it. Um, I'll just read what Bob Robinson says. He says, some vocations seem easily connected to working towards proximate justice. But there are people in vocations that can't figure out how their daily work connects with God's grand plan, how they are participating in God's mission of redemption of all things, in their daily work. How can someone in a run of the mill work find deeper meaning in that work?
Yeah. Well, Bob, I know you, and you know that I think about these questions like you do. They matter to me. Uh, so on the one hand, I mean, I have nothing to say to you that you don't already know. Um, I think about, somebody who talked to me some years ago. I was speaking in I guess it was Kentucky, actually. Uh, and he'd heard that I was going to be there, and I spoke into this kind of more formal setting for, over a lunch period of time, luncheon. And this guy walked up, not clearly not part of the regular group because he had a flannel shirt on. He had a kind of a bushy beard on his face. And he said, I just wanted to hear you and to meet you because, I read your book on vocation. And he said, I'm the kind of guy who finishes the day with sawdust in my beard. Uh, but I want you to know that, in fact, this idea of vocation has changed the way I think about the work that I do. Uh, it's given me some sense that, in fact, this is part of more than I have imagined, more than my boss requires of me, more than the people whose homes I'm working on. But I have maybe a different sense, a deeper sense that, in fact, I'm part of doing something in the world that makes more sense of what I do day by day. Uh, well, I mean, I agree with you completely, Bob. There's a lot of, you know, push come to bad shove work in this world. Um, and because you and I have been friends for a long time, you know that I spent some years of my life quoting Johnny Paycheck years ago. Take this job and shove it. I ain't working here no more. And that captured a certain moment in my life and thing I was looking at the world. While I've been a great fan of, appreciator and reader of Charles Dickens, uh, most people don't think about the fact that, in fact, Dickens wrote his Christmas Carol in the same city at the same time, same blocks really, uh, that Karl Marx wrote Das Kapital. Uh, so that's worth pondering, actually. I mean, what is it that draws us into Dickens in his story of, you know, of, you know, a greedy capitalist, to put it kind of crudely and simply, and somebody who's been left behind in the world, who got left out of the story. Uh, we love that story in its own way, but Karl Marx saw the same difficulties, same challenges in 19th century industrializing Europe that Dickens did. They wrote different stories about it. Uh, um, I agree with you, Bob. These are the questions of my life. In some ways, they are the questions which draw me into this project. The economics of mutuality. Remember, those are carefully chosen words. They're not just, it can't be just about those who own the Mars Corporation or the executive. It has to be something where honestly, people who are out about in the world, those who grow cocoa in Sierra Leone, have to be part of the story too. I could say more about that, but these are the things that I have cared about. I know you've cared about them as well.
It's funny. I was asked to contribute a chapter to a book about glorifying God in ordinary life, and they had people Square Halo books. It's called Ordinary Saints, where people write about raising chickens or grieving or making playlists or crocheting or whatever. All right, you're not in that book, are you, Steve? I don't think you are.
Mhm.
But I wrote a piece about being a retailer. And people think, well, you have such a neat job. You talk about books with people, you interview authors, you chat about big ideas. You're a Christian bookseller. But I decided to write not as the product I happen to sell, which happens to be books, but sort of the nitty gritty behind the scenes of being a retailer. And it was hard to think through how, in a proximate way, we can glorify God by practicing the presence well and being just in the way we do the nitty gritty of making change and ordering stuff and working with competitors and the supply chain and that kind of stuff. One guy comments here. He said, "I used to hate the Brother Lawrence story. I'm not sure why he ever would hate that, but he says, I love it now, not anymore. He gets that God's presence with the pots and the pans really does matter." So that's a good question, Bob. And Steve, it's an answer you've spent your life working on. Um, Geez, here's one more question. Can we ask one more? Here's a question about where the commenter says, "Oh, you know this person." says part of finding peace is lamenting and grieving the good that is not. Can you share an example of a person or a community that seems to do this well? We can also talk about this in another day too, she says. But this is important, I think, for all of us. The role of lament. And can you give an example of anybody that you've seen that kind of grieves well?
Hmm. Yeah. Again, I mean, it's in some ways harder to talk about this publicly because these are such deep things for all of us, and they matter as much as anything matters to us. I mean, sadly, maybe even tragically, most of the time the church doesn't grieve very well. We don't know how to lament. Um, I remember some years ago walking into a church that we were part of for a long time on a Sunday morning, kind of early for some reasons, and the person leading the music that morning, I saw him in passing. I said, "Are you going to, are we going to liturgically remember the the massacre this week at Virginia Tech University?" Um, because everyone who's walking in this morning will be thinking about that. What they've been thinking about for the last week of life. Everyone knows somebody. The story's in the paper all day long, and it's a terrible, terrible story here in Virginia. What will we do in our worship today to remember that? Because we can't just step into, you know, praise Jesus, praise Jesus, praise Jesus, as if somehow the world isn't hurt, wounded, and we're all feeling it deeply. Well, he hadn't thought about that for a moment, terribly in my mind. He just hadn't even considered that. And um, I'm not naming names here, other than to say that I think that mostly we don't know how to do that very well. Uh, uh, and I would commend, for example, the beautiful, tender, rich music of Porter's Gate, which of all the different albums they've put together now, one of them is simply called the Lament Songs. And if you need help, you know, grieving, wondering what to say, how to say what you need to say, because it's the deepest thing you ever wanted and needed to say in your life, I would just say go on to that music and ask the question, um, you know, what songs could I sing here to cry out to God in heaven that this is not the world that I want to live in? Um, and yet, I still believe, in fact, this isn't the end of the last story either. Uh, so I would just say that, there's a lot of work to be done in lament. Uh, some years ago, I was drawn into the music of a pretty well-known band, and it was music went around the country and the world, and people liked their music in some ways because they wrote about honest things, the things that everyone was thinking about, and they wrote about it very artfully and powerfully, and that was the substance of their music. And I was flying through Denver one time, and we talked on the phone about an album they were working on, and the question from the lead singer, who was the lead musician, can you cry out and be angry at God and still believe? I said, well, the Psalms are full of that, aren't they? Uh, we spent probably 2 years talking about, that question. Can you be angry? Can you be angry? Can you cry out and still hold on to what you believe to be true? Can that be part of what you believe to be true, that you can cry out? Uh, that song went on to, have a long history in, the music making, industry over the next couple of years, because they captured quite beautifully, very powerfully, very artfully the heartache of having to live in a world where sometimes we just need to cry out. Uh, and I think that's true, Byron. And I think that we need to have songs to sing that somehow make sense of the sorrows of our souls.
Friends, there are so many good questions still coming in. I don't know if we'll be able to save some of these um, and chat perhaps even online somehow as we navigate this. I'm going to let our friends at Paraclete Press help us with some of these comments that we didn't talk about. People are quoting song lyrics, and we've got good friends of yours and good friends of mine, Steve, sharing here. But I know we're running out of time. Thank you for this time, just allowing me to probe a little bit about the book. Thank you for writing the book. I know it was hard. You learned a lot. Even people want to know what you learned, but you put it in the book. So read that book, folks. You can order them from Hearts and Minds at 20% off, or get it wherever you buy your books at any independent bookstore. You'll know, even in the acknowledgments, that Steve thanks many people. he does this collaboratively. He has many dear friends. He has people around the world, and he tells their stories in the book. And Steve, I just, it's sincere. I read acknowledgments for a living. I get new books and I look at them. And there's something about your work that is just really real. And so I thank you for all of that. And I think I speak for everybody here that's just grateful that you're willing to host grief and somehow saunter. That there's an adventure here in this now and not yet world that we live in. And we hope this book is going to help people along the way. Any closing remarks, Steve, you want to make? Any final things? Geez, the book is so full of profound ideas, but simple stuff about making pancakes with your kids. And so, any closing words to take us home tonight?
You mentioned my life lived collaboratively, but I've dedicated the book to some friends who we have lived among for decades, actually, under this credo of the Clapham community around Wilberforce and his, you know, collaborators 250 years ago in London. But they had this credo, which Meg and I have lived with for all the years of our life, to choose a neighbor before you choose a house. And it isn't the 11th commandment. I never have seen it that way, but there's a lot of wisdom in that. Uh, for me, it has been simply, to keep your heart alive, which again, of course, is a pretty deep theme for me, to keep your heart alive in this wounded, broken world. You need things to be part of who you are and how you live. And I would say that having neighbors who share with you visions and hopes and longings and tears uh, uh, matters, more than you could possibly even imagine, actually. And so I dedicated the book to these friends who were long neighbors of ours. And in fact, the epilogue of the book, the appendix of the book, is about our life together over the course of a long, long, long time. And week by week, by week by week, for years upon years upon years, meeting together to think, to talk, to pray about what? Well, about our lives in the world. Because I would just say that we can't do it. We don't do it unless we have people to do it with. Um, so maybe that is my last word.
That is a fabulous, fabulous word, Steve. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thank you for hanging out a little bit. Thank you to Paraclete Press for doing such a nice job with the book and for hosting this event tonight. We hope this is going to be online. Maybe you can look for it at Steve's Facebook or mine. At our Book Notes newsletter, we'll share it at some point when it becomes available. And I guess we're going to say goodnight at this point, right, Steve?
I think we are.
Hope you
Yep.
stay warm down there in Virginia.
And you in Pennsylvania.
Thank you so much. We'll see you at the Jubilee Conference in Pittsburgh in a couple of weeks. And
Thank
to
you.
everyone, we thank you very much. God bless.
Bless.